this panel. We have Anthony Watts and Kesten Green who are going to make presentations. Again, I prefer to save time and let them have their time to speak and do a Q&A. Their bios are in the handouts that Heartland's provided for you. You can review those if you wish. Probably some of you know, sadly, Dr. Fred Seitz, pioneer in this whole thing, passed away yesterday. He was 94 or 95, something like that. Wonderful person. He's one of the funders of SPPI, and it's been a long time friend. It's really sad to lose Bob Jastrow and Fred Seitz in the same span of time. Is really sad. Anyway, having said that, let's go on. We're going to have the first presentation by Kesten Green, followed by Anthony, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Thank you, Bob. Now I'm talking, as the title implies, about a scientific forecasting contribution to climate change. So I'm here as a forecasting scientist, a forecasting researcher, rather than a climate researcher. So I'm going to start off by describing what I mean by, how's the microphone, by the way? Is that about right? Yeah.
You have to sort of speak into it.
Speak a bit closer, yep. Okay, so I'm speaking as a forecasting researcher, so I'm going to introduce the topic of scientific forecasting, explain what I mean by that, and I will then describe what the implications of scientific forecasting are for current efforts to forecast climate, and what the perspective of scientific forecasting is on current climate forecasting efforts. And this talk is based on work that Scott Armstrong of Wharton School and I have done. Am I getting the microphone right now? Am I? Thank you. Now, I was told that would turn me forward, but oh, yes, it is. Yeah. Now, let's start with the conclusions. The conclusions are reasonably simple. Global climate models, the general circulation models, the models that are used by the IPCC to make predictions, they're really tools for the modelers to speculate. They're not scientific forecasting methods in any sense that would be recognised as by science. The reason for this, or part of the reason for this, is the situation is just too complex and uncertain for the kind of complex models that they use to work. The situation could be characterized as one of ignorance, and we know so little, or not sufficient anyway, about climate to construct complex models and make predictions about the next 100 years or so. So to the extent that the most scientific forecast at the moment is a simple naive model that the next 100 years, which is what the IPCC claim to forecast, on average, we would expect to be the same as the last 1,000 years, say. That would be a simple naive model, and that's going to be very hard to beat given the current state of knowledge about how the climate works. So we may be able to make some progress on forecasting what climate's going to be like over the next 100 years, but it's not by arguing about the facts. It's not about experts arguing between themselves. It's about talking about how best we can apply what we know about forecasting, what we know works in forecasting, to the problem of climate. I'm not holding my breath on whether we can do any better than a simple naive model, but that's the direction for progress. And we suggest that in order to formulate public policy in a responsible way, we not only need to know about the physical science, we need to, but policies are all about what's happening in the future. We also need to use scientific forecasting methods to predict what is going to happen. And in the absence of scientific forecasts, we don't have a solid basis for public policy. And the best response to that, as Christopher Monckton suggested, is to have the courage to do nothing. So as I suggested, as I mentioned, this talk is based on a paper that was published late last year in the Energy and Environment journal. Neither Scott Armstrong, my colleague in this, nor myself claim to be experts on climate. We do make claims to be experts on forecasting. We haven't received any funding for doing research on climate forecasting, although we do receive some sponsorship for our science forecast, well, in particular publicpolicyforecasting.com and theclimatebet.com. The former, publicpolicyforecasting.com, is what we call a special interest group of the forecastingprinciples.com site. And I'll talk a little bit more about that site later. The Climate Bet site we established when Scott Armstrong challenged Al Gore to a bet on what was going to happen to climate over the next, to temperatures specifically over the next 10 years. And he proposed a $10,000 bet to increase the level of interest, but also to increase the interest in scientific forecasting of climate change, because Al Gore very much, as I understand, claims to want to bring science, to listen to the science, to bring science to the debate and so on. So Scott Armstrong said, well, okay, let's bring science to this. I'm a forecasting scientist. I'm prepared to put up $10,000 of my own money to be donated to a charity of my choosing if I win. And if you put up $10,000 of yours, the money can go to a charity of your choosing if you win. And Scott's bet was that he would, the climate, the temperature would be the same over the next 10 years as it is now, essentially. And he asked Al Gore to nominate a particular climate model, and the unadjusted output of that would be his stake, his bet, if you like. And there's been a little bit of email exchange from personal assistants and all the rest of it. The most recent round was that Al Gore, through his assistant, had said, well, I'm not prepared to consider a monetary bet. And Scott has said, well, that's fine. Let's do it for the sake of the science alone. We don't have to involve money in this. And so far, that's all we've heard. We haven't heard back on the latest round, which was perhaps a week or two ago. So if you want an update, go to the climatebet.com and see if we've had any progress on that. This slide is almost redundant at this session today. In a sense, we wouldn't be here, would we, if the science were indeed settled. I mean, the IP, we sometimes wonder that the IPCC seem to be suggesting when they say that the science is settled, that it's some kind of idealized billiard ball world that they can construct simple mathematical models of, and the exact answer is going to fall out. But from what we're hearing from all the climate scientists today, that's not the case. And of course, consensuses, well, I'm stretching my Latin there. Consensuses. Well, here are a couple of examples from Ptolemy from nearly a couple of thousand years ago, and from a more recent CIA report that someone alluded to recently. Now, what is scientific forecasting? I mean, it's a scientific discipline like any other. It's based on experiments, observations, and at the end of the day, evidence. And the evidence has come from nearly 70-odd years of research, scientific research, experimentation in many disciplines. And you'll see a few of them listed there. And fortunately for us and mankind in general, all that research has been summarised in the form of principles or guidelines, rules, condition and action statements. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of principles, there are about 140 of them. And they're readily available. You know, if anyone is interested in forecasting anything, all they need to do is to type in the single word forecasting into their search engine. Google comes up with something like 70 million forecasting sites that are relevant to the word forecasting. Well, the first one of those is forecastingprinciples.com. So it's not hard to find these rules or guidelines for anyone who does want to forecast anything. They're also available in Scott Armstrong's book. He's the editor of and principal author of the Principles of Forecasting Handbook, and that's a compilation of the efforts of what have we got, 39 authors and 123 reviewers, pulling all that research together. So that's what I'm referring to when I talk about scientific forecasting, that knowledge base distilled into principles, rules, guidelines, 140 of them. I mean, here are some examples, which I won't go into detail, of what principles are that are relevant to the problem of forecasting climate. I'll come back to some of these, particularly the first of these, which is, on first pass controversial and surprising to many people, because this is the thing about forecasting principles, and they are useful because they're not all intuitive. We don't know them all already just by deduction or having lived life. Some of them are quite counterintuitive, although they are supported by much research. So it is important to know the principles if you're going to have a hope of making valid forecasts. Another one that's relevant to the situation we're concerned with today is be conservative when uncertainty is high. And conservative in this context means don't go extrapolating short-term trends wildly. You should tend to damp down your extrapolations in the face of uncertainty. Some physical scientists have suggested to us that the climate is somehow immune from forecasting principles, and we're a little bit puzzled by that. I mean, perhaps some of the terminology we use comes from the social sciences. Perhaps that's a problem, but we ask physical scientists, well, please have a look at the principles, and if you've got any evidence, scientific evidence, that a particular principle doesn't apply to the physical sciences, please give us your evidence, because we will put that up on the site. We'll modify the wording of the principle to make it clear that it doesn't apply to physical systems. So far, we haven't had any offers on that, no offers of evidence there. I like to think principles like avoid biased data apply to the physical sciences. Adjust time series for extraordinary events, volcanic eruptions, for example. I mean, that seems a pretty reasonable principle for physical scientists to apply if they were wanting to forecast. So as forecasters, we look at this problem of climate, what's going to happen to climate over the next 100 years, and in this way. We're looking at it in terms of its public policy ramifications. There's actually three separate forecasting problems, and we're simplifying a little bit. The first of these, what's going to happen to long-term to temperature? The second, what are the effects of we've got to forecast what the effects of the temperature changes are. And the third and final one, when you're concerned with public policy, is, well, what plausible policies are there, and what would be the effect of those feasible policies, rather, on the climate, or anything else, everything else for that matter, the economy. What would the effects of those be? So I'm just going to concern myself with the first of these ones, because clearly if you fall down on the first one, if you can't offer up scientific forecasts of temperature changes, then you've got to stop there and go back to the drawing board, or as Christopher Monckton suggests, have the courage to do nothing. Some climate modelers claim that their models don't make forecasts, and I was just talking to someone about this a little earlier. Kevin Trenberth perhaps is the most famous exponent of this. He was here in this very hotel last June for the International Symposium on Forecasting, and he was giving a keynote address, and he made the claim that the IPCC climate models do not make forecasts. Well, it seems like an extraordinary statement, really, doesn't it? Because if that's the case, we don't have anything to worry about. And if there's no forecast of anything bad, good, or anything happening, well, let's give it away. We don't need to worry. Again, as Christopher Monckton says, have the courage to do nothing. Well, that would be easy if it was simple as that. But because it does seem that the IPCC are making claims to forecast, and certainly in the minds of the politicians and the general public, who are scared silly, and my 11-year-olds schoolmates who've been shown the Al Gore movie and all the rest of it, they look like forecasts to them, and they're scared silly. So, and of course we find that other climate forecasters do make specific claims to forecast. In fact, the IPCC document itself, here are the figures: forecast and its derivatives, forecasting and so on, occur 37 times, and predict 90 times in its different variations, all in the course of one chapter, Chapter 8 of the IPCC report. And I'll introduce some further evidence that the people responsible for the IPCC report do regard what they do as forecasting as well. I'll come to that shortly. But in a sense, we agree with Kevin Trenberth that there aren't any forecasts, because as I said in my introduction, my conclusions, the models aren't valid forecasting methods. So in a sense, he's right. We see the climate experts as using the models to express their judgments, express their opinions. They decide what goes into the models, the variables, the data series they choose, how they adjust those series, the parameters, and what comes out. If they don't like the outputs of the models, they reject that and choose something else. So in effect, what the IPCC people are doing, the climate models are doing, is they're using their unaided judgment, unaided by any formal forecasting method, just a lot of elaborate maths turning their judgments into computer code. They're using those to make predictions. So they're, in effect, unaided expert judgments. Now, you might ask, if you hadn't seen the earlier slide, well, isn't it reasonable for experts on a topic to make unaided forecasts, judgmental forecasts? Don't their opinions count on these things as to what's going to happen over the next 100 years? Well, that's quite a reasonable question. I mean, we're all experts, and I'm sure most of us like to make predictions. A little diversion with a quote from Nikola Tesla there, that today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments and wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure that has no relation to reality. He made that observation 70-odd years ago. So can climate experts make useful forecasts? Well, Scott Armstrong, back in his 1978 book, this is an earlier book, summarised the studies up to that point, and they all pointed in the same direction, that experts were no better than novices at making predictions using their judgment. And it's an important distinction, and this is not saying that expertise doesn't exist. What it's saying is that when experts make predictions using their judgment, they're no better than novices. Now that's a hard one to swallow, and I when I'm struggling to think about, to come to terms with that, I think about current affairs shows or topics of moment when the press wheel in top experts and get them to sit down and debate it. Well, they're all bona fide experts, but they can come up with quite different predictions about what's going to happen. Whether it's what's going to happen when we invade Iraq or what's going to happen to the climate, as we know. So there's a bit of a common sense test that if in fact experts could make valid unaided judgment forecasts, then mostly they would agree. Now, Phil Tetlock approached the problem in a different way. Our friend Phil Tetlock from Berkeley spent 20 years asking experts to make predictions about things that were going on in the world, economic and political things. And his book, Expert Political Judgment, I think it's called, it's got a picture of a hedgehog and a fox on the front cover, provides his findings, and his findings are essentially the same, that experts are no better than novices at making predictions. There are some exceptions. I mean, there are some areas where experts can make predictions, but they're rare, and they involve repetitive situations that are pretty much the same every time, and they get rapid and unambiguous feedback. I mean, 1 or 2 or 3 day ahead weather forecasting would be an example, but there aren't too many problems in real life that fit that mould, and 100-year climate certainly isn't one of them. But no one's going to believe this, of course, so experts will continue to make unaided judgment predictions until we're all familiar with the forecasting literature, perhaps. So here's some implications for that. I won't dwell on this one. So what I want to come to really is the last point here. There's no use in arguing about it, applying our judgment to the problem unaided. What is required is for climate experts to apply scientific forecasting methods to the problem. So the process is what's important. So back to climate. We wondered how aware the climate scientists were of forecasting research, of scientific forecasting, and so we did a search to find out whether there were any references to scientific research on forecasting in the global warming literature, and we couldn't find any. And as I suggested, it's not hard to find. You just do a Google search for the word forecasting, and it's there. So. And that seems to us, we may be a bit vain, but it seems to us that it was a simple effort for people to make, and it wasn't made. We then wanted to identify particular forecasts that we could look at, forecasting processes that we could look at from a scientific forecaster's point of view, to judge them, to audit them. And so to do that, well, we thought we've actually got to make sure that we are auditing the right paper. So we did a little survey and sent out an email questionnaire to people, and you can see the second part of the question there. In your opinion, which scientific article is the source of the most credible forecasts of global average temperatures over the rest of the century? That was the problem we wanted to look at, and of the 240 experts, and a lot of them were IPCC people, how many is it? 51 of them sent in responses, and most of those nominated the IPCC's latest report, in particular Chapter 8, which is the model evaluation chapter. So we thought, all right, that's what we're going to have a look at and see how it measures up against scientific forecasting principles. Now you'll notice this is the second or third piece of evidence that the IPCC efforts are regarded as forecasts, because the authors and others, the IPCC authors and others who responded to this, responded to the question that mentions credible forecasts of global average temperatures. So they clearly thought they were forecasting or signing off on some forecasts. We then checked on the references of the Chapter 8 itself, and there were 650 of those. And again, we couldn't find any that related to scientific forecasting. So here was this chapter, this whole effort that seemed to have no awareness of the literature on scientific forecasting, on any research that had been done on scientific forecasting. We then set about auditing that chapter, and first of all we identified the relevant principles. I mean, not all of the 140 principles are relevant to every problem. And then we assessed whether the procedures that were described in the chapter conformed to the principles, or to what extent they conformed to the principles. And we assessed that 127 out of the 140 principles were relevant. We used the forecasting audit software, which is available on the principlesofforecasting.com site. And essentially, it steps you through a series of questions, and you can evaluate and get a report on a proposed forecasting approach, or some forecasting efforts that have already been made. No, excuse me, I'm just going to interrupt a minute. Now, there's just the two of us speaking.
Yes. How much time do you need?
10? Yeah. Okay, I'm taking it slowly, but I'll speed up a bit. Sorry. Armstrong and I rated the procedures that were described in the chapter independently, and we had some disagreements, but mostly we agreed on our ratings. We then had a bit of an exchange of emails, a handful of those, and agreed to the ratings after a relatively modest level of discussion. We found when we looked at the chapter that we could only rate against 89 of those principles out of the 127 that we thought were relevant, because there wasn't enough information. And we found that 72 of the principles were contravened by the procedures that were described in that chapter. And that translates, after you allow for some uncertainties, to 13% of principles being properly applied by the IPCC modelers, 13%. And I challenge you to suggest a discipline, an occupation, where applying 13% of the principles, or best practice or standard practice for the discipline, would be regarded as acceptable. Seems like an extraordinary thing. They're setting out to forecast for 100 years into the future, major implications for public policy, major implications of the public policy, and they applied 13% of scientific forecasting principles. Some examples of the contraventions were they didn't use simple forecasting methods, which is what's dictated in a situation like this, where you've got a high level of uncertainty. Building a complex model when you don't even know the direction of some of the parameters, some of the effects, is inviting multiplication of errors. And it also means that it's very difficult to find errors. it's very difficult for other people to have a look at your models and find any errors. Test on out of sample data, we could see little evidence that they were testing 100 years into the future blind on the data series. And provide easy access to the data was another contribution. All these are listed. They're all in the paper on the forecastingprinciples.com site. So as I say, it's fully disclosed on the publicpolicyforecasting.com pages. And we would love other people to do this exercise, to take Chapter 8 and do your own audit. Use the forecasting audit software, and we will publish your audit. Please even apply it to other public policy forecasting problems or other climate forecasts. If you think you're doing some climate forecasting, it'd be a good place to start. Given the complexity of climate and the state of knowledge, the uncertainty about so much of it, scientific forecasting tells us that it will be very difficult to beat a simple, naive model. Something along the lines of the next 100 years, which is what the IPCC are talking about, will be much the same on average as the last 1,000 years. And that's got to be the starting point for any efforts to try to improve forecasting. And I suggest that, given the state of knowledge, that would be rather difficult. But I'm not saying that it's impossible. It may be possible to improve on forecasting. And I don't want to go into that in any great detail, but there are some methods, scientific forecasting methods, that may help us to improve on that. So the three forecasting problems that I described at the beginning, starting off with the one we've just looked at, long-term temperature change. The forecasting exercise falls over with the first one because we don't have scientific forecasts of climate change, and therefore it would be improper to move on to even considering the effects of change or the effects of feasible policy alternatives. It's inappropriate to develop public policy on the basis of experts' judgments. If the public policy requires forecasts, then we need both the experts and we need the scientific forecasting methods in order to obtain scientific forecasts on which to base public policy. So, to come back to the conclusions, we've been unable to find any scientific forecasts of global warming. And I'm going to call it quits there.